In late March 2006, Columbus, Ohio, was preparing for the start of spring break. The Ohio State University campus was busy, the city's nightlife districts active as students gathered for the final weekend before the break began. Among them was 27-year-old medical student Brian Shaffer, who had finished a week of exams and planned to spend the evening visiting a few bars with friends. The night started routinely in an area known for crowded venues, live music, and steady foot traffic. Nothing about the first hours suggested anything out of the ordinary. But by early morning, after the bars closed and the crowds thinned, Brian had not returned home, and no one could account for his movements. What followed became one of the most widely examined missing person investigations in the region. In March 2006, Columbus, Ohio, operated within its usual academic and social rhythm as the spring break period approached. The Ohio State University campus, one of the largest in the United States, maintained a steady flow of activity with students completing exams, preparing for travel, or organizing small gatherings before leaving the city for the week. Businesses in the university district, restaurants, bars, convenience stores, and entertainment venues, followed the predictable increase in weekend traffic that occurred at this time of year. For many students, the final week of March marked the end of midterm examinations. This included 27-year-old medical student Brian Shaffer, who had spent the days leading up to March 31st in intensive study sessions and clinical obligations. His schedule was demanding, leaving little time for leisure, and the conclusion of an important exam on Friday provided the first opportunity in several weeks for a break from academic responsibilities. Available records indicate that Brian completed his exam that afternoon and returned home to rest before meeting a close friend later in the evening. The area surrounding North High Street, adjacent to the OSU campus, contained a dense concentration of bars and student-oriented businesses. One of these venues, the Ugly Tuna Saloon, was located within the South Campus Gateway, a recently developed area containing retail shops, restaurants, a cinema, and residential units. The gateway structure featured multiple stairways, escalators, and an elevated entryway leading to the bar. This arrangement, combined with the presence of several surveillance cameras, made the area a familiar, well-lit part of the university's nightlife environment. On March 31st, the flow of people entering and exiting businesses in the gateway followed ordinary Friday patterns. Groups moved between establishments, and foot traffic extended along High Street as students navigated the area. Weather reports from that evening do not indicate any extraordinary conditions that would have affected typical activity. There were no documented disruptions or events in the district before Brian began his night out. Throughout the late afternoon, Brian maintained normal communication with friends and his girlfriend, who was on a short trip with her family at the time. He had arranged to meet his friend William Clint Florence after taking time to rest at home. The plan was uncomplicated. The two would visit several bars, beginning with locations closer to their residences and eventually making their way toward the gateway area. This type of progression from one bar to another over the course of an evening was common for students in the district. Brian's known actions before meeting Clint reflected typical pre-evening routines. He spoke briefly with his father earlier in the day, confirmed evening plans, and prepared to go out. There are no records indicating unusual behavior, irregular scheduling, or any significant deviations from what friends described as his standard approach to socializing. By early evening, both men were in contact and preparing to begin their night out. Columbus police records and public reporting later identified this as the starting point of the timeline that would eventually become central to the investigation. At this stage, However, nothing about the environment, the planning, or the interaction suggested that the night would diverge from established patterns. The University District, the Gateway Complex, and the surrounding bars formed a highly frequented setting for students, and the combination of midterms ending and spring break beginning made this particular Friday well aligned with common social activity. Within this context, Brian entered the evening under routine circumstances, heading into a familiar environment with a close friend and no indication of any unusual concerns or disruptions. It was this ordinary backdrop that framed the final confirmed hours in Brian Shaffer's known timeline, hours that would later be examined repeatedly through surveillance footage, interviews, and official reports. At the outset, however, the evening was indistinguishable from many others that took place in the same district. Brian met his friend William Clint Florence during the early evening hours of March 31st, 2006. Their plan was straightforward. Visit a small number of bars in the University District to mark the end of Brian's exam period. Records and witness statements indicate that the two began the night at a bar near Brian's residence before moving north along High Street, following a route that many students used when visiting multiple venues in one night. Surveillance footage, timestamps on debit card transactions, and later police summaries helped confirm several points along their path. The early portion of the evening proceeded without incident. Both men visited at least one bar before deciding to meet another acquaintance, Meredith Reed, who offered to drive them to the South Campus Gateway area. Reed later stated to investigators that she picked the two up and transported them to the Ugly Tuna Saloon, arriving shortly before 9 p.m. Her involvement at this stage provided police with a reliable timestamp and movement record for the group. The Ugly Tuna Saloon occupied an upper level within the Gateway complex, accessed by escalator or stairs from the main walkway below. Because of ongoing development in the area at the time, several construction barriers and temporary walkways bordered the complex. These details would later become relevant when investigators reviewed the building's layout and potential exit points. Surveillance footage captured the group's arrival. Cameras positioned at the escalator and near the bar's entrance recorded steady foot traffic, including the three individuals making their way inside. The video frames confirmed their approximate arrival time and verified that Brian was walking independently and engaging normally with the others. There is no recorded indication of unusual behavior, conflict, or distress during this initial entry. Inside the bar, the group moved among the crowd. The evening was typical for the venue. Moderate to heavy attendance, a mix of students and young adults, and music that made conversation more challenging in certain areas. Witness accounts differ in small details, but align on the general point that Brian consumed several drinks over the course of the night. Police later reviewed statements from individuals present that evening, though none suggested any conflict involving Brian during this period. As the night progressed, the group continued to move within and around the bar. Clint and Meredith later stated that they occasionally separated from Brian as they navigated the crowded environment. In the context of this venue, such separations were ordinary. Individuals often shifted between the bar, seating, and the small open areas inside the establishment. These moments of separation were confirmed through the fragmented nature of available surveillance footage, which captured various angles but did not provide continuous, unobstructed coverage of the interior. By approximately midnight, the bar was nearing one of its peak attendance periods. Foot traffic in the Gateway corridor increased correspondingly, and surveillance cameras recorded a steady flow of patrons entering and leaving through the main entrance. The cameras captured Brian at several points that night, including a moment where he appeared near the entrance conversing with two women he knew from previous classes. This interaction was later verified through their own statements to investigators. The footage showed a brief exchange before Brian moved back toward the interior of the bar. This moment becomes significant in the timeline because it is the last confirmed recording of Brian Shaffer on any available surveillance system. The footage shows him stepping away from the entrance area and re-entering the bar. After this point, no camera captured him leaving the venue or appearing in any adjacent corridor, stairwell, or walkway. Clint and Meredith remained unaware of Brian's disappearance at this stage. They later told police that they assumed he had stepped away temporarily and would rejoin them before closing time. When the bar began to empty out, the two looked for him, but were unable to locate him inside. They waited near the exit, expecting him to appear with the departing crowd. When he did not, they eventually left the gateway area under the impression that he had made separate arrangements to go home. The routine nature of the night up to this point, common locations, familiar movements, normal interactions, stands in contrast to the later difficulty investigators faced in reconstructing Brian's final confirmed movements. The absence of a clear exit on video would become one of the defining elements of the case. The final confirmed image of Brian Shaffer comes from the surveillance camera positioned near the entrance of the Ugly Tuna Saloon. The footage, later reviewed extensively by investigators, shows Brian speaking briefly with two women he knew from earlier courses at Ohio State. The exchange appears casual. After the short conversation ends, Brian moves back toward the interior of the bar, walking out of the camera's line of sight. This moment, captured shortly before 2 a.m., marks the last verified recording of his presence. The surveillance system at the Ugly Tuna covered the escalator area, the immediate entrance, and part of the walkway outside. Inside the bar, coverage was limited by the building's layout and the available camera angles. The bar did not have complete interior surveillance, which meant investigators could not track every movement of patrons once they stepped away from the entrance. This limitation became a central factor in the difficulty of reconstructing Brian's final movements. The camera at the entrance was positioned to capture anyone entering or exiting through the main doorway. As investigators noted later, the building's structure funneled most incoming and outgoing foot traffic past that camera. The expectation was that any individual who entered or left through the front would appear in at least one frame. Forensic video specialists examined the footage repeatedly, slowing frames, enhancing clarity, and checking timestamps. None of these reviews produced an image of Brian exiting the bar. The Gateway complex contained additional stairways, employee corridors, and an emergency exit that led to an outdoor construction area. Investigators checked whether these alternative paths could have allowed someone to leave without being captured by the primary cameras. According to reports, most alternate paths still required passing in front of at least one surveillance point. The emergency exit at that time triggered an alarm when opened, and there were no records indicating such an alarm occurred during the relevant window. Interviews with employees confirmed that the bar was operating normally that night. Staff members recalled that the venue was crowded but manageable, and no incidents were reported involving Brian or his group. No witnesses described seeing him in distress, arguing with anyone, or leaving the bar alone or with others. The absence of such observations is consistent across interviews conducted in the days that followed. As closing time approached, the usual pattern of patrons preparing to leave occurred. Groups gathered near the exit, others lined up to pay tabs, and individuals moved toward the escalator area outside. The surveillance footage showed a steady stream of people exiting the bar between approximately 1:30 a.m. and 2:30 a.m. Although Clint and Meredith appeared on the recordings, Brian did not. For investigators, the key problem was straightforward. The bar had a single main entrance, and this entrance was monitored by a functioning camera. The footage captured all outgoing patrons except Brian. This discrepancy became the central mystery of the case, as it suggested that either he left through a route not accounted for, or that his exit was not captured due to a blind spot or obstruction unknown at the time. The two women Brian spoke with near the entrance reported nothing unusual about the interaction. They stated that he appeared fully coherent and that their conversation was brief before he moved back inside. There were no indications of confusion, intoxication beyond ordinary levels, or distress. Their statements remained consistent throughout the investigation. By the time the bar began clearing out, Brian was no longer visible to anyone in his group. Clint and Meredith looked for him near the entrance and waited for him to appear as the venue emptied. When he did not, they assumed he had chosen to leave on his own or had arranged to meet someone else. It was not uncommon for groups to separate during nights out in the district, and on previous occasions Brian had returned home independently after such outings. This final confirmed sighting, brief, uneventful, and followed by an unexplained absence, formed the boundary between what investigators could verify and what remained unaccounted for in the hours that followed. The unexplained gap in Brian Shaffer's timeline begins immediately after the last confirmed surveillance footage at the bar's entrance. Once he stepped out of frame and back into the interior, no additional visual documentation exists. This absence created a series of challenges for investigators attempting to establish his movements between approximately 1:55 a.m. and the bar's final closing procedures, shortly after 2 a.m. Clint and Meredith remained inside the venue for some time after Brian walked away. Both later reported that they expected him to return shortly, assuming he had stepped aside to talk with someone or move through the crowded environment. When he did not reappear, they began scanning the bar. They checked the areas near the restrooms, seating, and the interior walkway, though neither recalled conducting an extended search at that point. The assumption that he would rejoin them at the exit influenced their decision to wait near the front rather than moving through the entire bar. When the bar began closing procedures, patrons gradually exited, forming small clusters near the escalator and stairways outside. Surveillance footage showed Clint and Meredith leaving the bar along with the outgoing crowd. They remained near the entrance for several minutes afterward, expecting Brian to emerge. When he did not, they left the gateway area. Brian's absence did not immediately raise concern among his friends. He had on previous occasions left gatherings without formal goodbyes, especially if he planned to walk home or meet someone else. The assumption that he had simply gone ahead or chosen another route was consistent with normal social behavior in this environment. Clint later stated that he believed Brian had decided to end the night early. Brian's girlfriend attempted to reach him the next morning, but this was also not unusual. He often slept late after nights out. By the afternoon, however, when repeated calls went unanswered, concern began to grow. Scheduled plans for the upcoming day went unattended, and Brian did not check in with friends or family. These missed communications became significant, as he was known to stay in regular contact. By the evening of April 1st, Brian's father and girlfriend were increasingly alarmed. They contacted friends to determine whether anyone had seen him after the bar closed. When no one could confirm contact with him after the previous night, the family reached out to police. The formal missing person report was filed late that weekend. Columbus police began their initial review by establishing the timeline between Brian's arrival at the bar and the venue's closing. They obtained surveillance footage from the Gateway complex, the escalator area, and adjacent businesses. Early in the investigation, they confirmed that Brian was not recorded leaving the bar through the main entrance. This discovery shifted the inquiry toward identifying alternate routes or explanations for his absence from the footage. Police interviewed staff members, reviewed exterior footage, and checked areas around the Gateway complex. There were no signs of a disturbance, no witnesses reporting unusual behavior, and no evidence indicating that Brian had been seen outside the bar after 2 a.m. Search efforts expanded beyond the immediate area, including checks of hospitals, the campus grounds, and transit routes. None produced relevant findings. This gap, from the moment Brian stepped back inside the bar to the point where the venue closed, became the central period requiring reconstruction. Despite interviews, video review, and on-site checks, investigators were unable to determine where he was during the final minutes before the bar closed, or how he might have left the building without being recorded. The absence of Brian on any exterior camera was a consistent, documented fact. It was this detail, more than any other, that separated his case from typical missing person investigations. When Brian Shaffer did not respond to calls or messages throughout April 1st, concern among his family and friends grew rapidly. His absence from pre-planned activities was unusual. By the afternoon, his girlfriend had attempted to reach him repeatedly, and the lack of response prompted her to check with others who might have seen him after the night out. None had. As these conversations circulated, it became clear that no one had spoken with or heard from Brian since the early hours of April 1st. Late that evening, the Shaffer family contacted police to file a missing person report. Columbus police began with standard procedures, confirming Brian's last known movements, identifying the individuals he had been with, and reviewing available records. Officers visited Brian's apartment, which showed no signs of forced entry or unusual activity. His car was still parked there, and nothing suggested he had packed for a trip or left voluntarily for an extended period. His cell phone, according to provider records, had shown no activity since shortly after the night at the bar. Investigators interviewed Clint and Meredith, who outlined the structure of the evening and confirmed that Brian had separated from them inside the Ugly Tuna Saloona shortly before closing. Their accounts were consistent about when they last saw him and the assumption that he had left independently. Both cooperated with the initial rounds of questioning and provided the timeline as they understood it. Police next approached the Gateway complex and requested access to surveillance footage. The management of the building provided all recordings from relevant cameras, including those covering the escalator, the exterior walkway, and portions of the bar's entrance. Reviewing these recordings became the central focus of the early investigative efforts. Detectives looked for any frame that might show Brian exiting the bar, but the footage did not contain an image of him leaving through the main entrance. Search efforts expanded as the weekend progressed. Officers canvassed the surrounding neighborhood, speaking with nearby businesses, on-duty security personnel, and residents who lived near the Gateway area. They checked hospitals and urgent care centers for any unidentified patients who might match Brian's description. None of these inquiries produced relevant information. By April 2nd, police organized a more structured search operation. Officers walked through areas adjacent to the Gateway complex, including construction zones, alleys, stairwells, dumpsters, and access points used by maintenance crews. These areas were documented and photographed, and officers returned several times to verify that nothing had been missed. No physical evidence associated with Brian was found. Investigators visited the Olentangy River corridor, located a short distance from the University District. Although there was no indication that Brian had walked in that direction, rivers and wooded areas often receive attention in missing person searches. Police checked embankments, footpaths, and several access points along the river. Specialized teams were not initially deployed, but visual inspections were carried out. Again, no findings connected to Brian were discovered. On April 3rd, officers conducted additional interviews with friends, former classmates, co-workers, and residents of Brian's apartment building. They searched for any indication that he might have arranged to meet someone after the night at the bar. None of the individuals contacted reported receiving messages or plans from him for that evening. His phone record showed no outgoing or incoming calls after 10 minutes past midnight, except for unanswered attempts from friends and family after he was reported missing. The absence of financial activity became another critical indicator for detectives. Brian had used his bank accounts regularly for routine expenses, but no withdrawals, card transactions, or online activity occurred after March 31st. This lack of activity suggested that he had not accessed funds to travel or support himself elsewhere. By the end of the first several days, investigators had established a clear picture of the early timeline, but had no evidence indicating where Brian had gone after he stepped out of the camera's view at the bar. The searches produced no physical clues, and no eyewitnesses came forward to place him outside the venue. The case transitioned from a missing person inquiry with an expected quick resolution to a more complex investigation without a definable direction. One of the most challenging aspects of the investigation became the analysis of surveillance footage at the South Campus Gateway. The Ugly Tuna Saloon's main entrance was positioned on an elevated platform, accessible by stairs and an escalator. Cameras monitored these access points and were intended to capture most of the incoming and outgoing foot traffic. Detectives conducted repeated reviews to confirm whether Brian had appeared at any moment after his last recorded sighting near the entrance. The camera's placement required outgoing patrons to pass directly through the monitored area. Over the course of the night, dozens of individuals were recorded entering and leaving. Investigators documented each identifiable entry and exit, cross-checking timestamps, and noting any individuals who appeared multiple times. Every person who left the bar after 1:55 a.m. was visible on the footage, except Brian. Video forensics teams from Columbus Police reviewed the recordings frame by frame. They enhanced portions of the footage, slowed playback, isolated moving objects, and checked for any obscured figures. None of these methods revealed Brian. The equipment was functioning, the timestamps aligned, and the image quality was sufficient to identify other individuals in the crowd. The absence of Brian from the exit recordings thus remained a verified detail. Detectives evaluated alternative exits. The building contained an emergency door that led to an unfinished construction area. This exit, according to employees, would have triggered an alarm if opened. No alarms were reported that night. Police tested the door to confirm its condition, and the mechanism appeared functional. Another interior hallway connected to service areas used by employees, but staff reported that these zones were not accessible to patrons and required key access. The escalator camera captured continuous movement throughout the closing period. Clint and Meredith appeared clearly in the feed as they left shortly after 2 a.m. Groups of other patrons descended shortly before and after them. Investigators reviewed the possibility that Brian could have been obscured by others, but all individuals in the crowded frames were identifiable, and none matched Brian's clothing or appearance from earlier footage. A second camera showed the outdoor walkway. This footage captured pedestrians passing through the gateway area after bars closed. Again, investigators saw no sign of Brian. They considered whether he might have changed clothing or altered appearance, but no evidence supported such a scenario, and no witnesses reported unusual behavior at the exits. Detectives also assessed blind spots. In any camera system, partial obstructions can exist, especially in high-traffic environments. But the structure of the entrance, combined with the available vantage points, made it difficult for someone to exit without being seen. Police returned to the site multiple times, walking through possible paths while referencing camera angles. Their conclusion remained consistent. The cameras did not show Brian leaving through any monitored point. Columbus police also cross-referenced footage from neighboring businesses. Some cameras faced the street, capturing sidewalk activity along High Street. Others overlooked parking lots or building entrances. None of these recordings contained images of Brian during the relevant window. The lack of a recorded exit became the defining anomaly of the case. Despite functioning equipment, normal foot traffic patterns, and multiple vantage points, Brian did not appear on any camera after re-entering the bar. This absence was not merely unexplained. It conflicted with the expectation that any patron leaving the venue should have been documented. Investigators noted this as a factual outcome rather than an interpretive one. Brian entered the bar, was recorded near the entrance, re-entered the bar interior, and was not captured leaving. All subsequent investigative challenges stemmed from this single gap in the documented timeline. As the first days of the investigation concluded without meaningful leads, Columbus police expanded their efforts beyond the initial search radius. Detectives focused first on verifying all available movements from individuals who had been with Brian on the night he disappeared. Follow-up interviews were conducted with Clint, Meredith, and the two women who last spoke with Brian near the bar entrance. Each individual repeated their original accounts, and none reported seeing or hearing from Brian after he walked back toward the interior of the bar. Investigators extended interviews to bar staff, including bartenders, servers, security personnel, and the individuals responsible for closing procedures. Their statements aligned. No incidents involving Brian were recorded, and no staff member recalled seeing him after 1:55 a.m. Police confirmed that no one had been removed from the bar that evening and that no disturbances occurred near the time Brian vanished from view. Attention shifted to other bars and establishments Brian and his friends had visited earlier in the night. Detectives contacted businesses along High Street to verify whether he had attempted to re-enter any locations or appeared outside after leaving the Ugly Tuna Saloon. None had records, surveillance footage, or eyewitness accounts placing him in the area after 2 a.m. Phone records provided additional clarity. Brian's mobile phone did not register outgoing or incoming calls after he was last known to be inside the bar. Investigators worked with the provider to check for late-night tower connections, but there was no activity indicating movement or attempted communication. This absence of digital traces suggested that his phone remained inactive through the night and the following days. Columbus police also examined transportation logs. They contacted local taxi companies and nearby bus services to determine whether any driver had picked up a passenger matching Brian's description. No such reports were found. Ride-hailing services were not widely used at the time, and there were no relevant electronic records that could supplement this line of inquiry. Detectives also contacted hospitals and urgent care centers within a wider radius. Staff members were asked to review logs for unidentified patients or individuals admitted without identification. No matches were discovered. Emergency service call logs were reviewed for the hours surrounding Brian's disappearance, and none referenced incidents near the Gateway complex involving someone matching his description. As days passed without new information, the investigation gained increased media attention. Local news agencies covered the case, urging residents to come forward with any relevant details. Flyers with Brian's photograph and last known clothing were distributed throughout Columbus, including campus buildings, bus stops, and commercial areas. Despite the volume of coverage, no new leads emerged. The absence of evidence made it difficult for investigators to determine whether Brian left the bar voluntarily, unintentionally, or under circumstances involving others. Without physical clues or verified sightings, the case offered few points from which to develop new investigative directions. The lack of digital activity, financial transactions, or travel records reinforced the difficulty of determining what occurred after he stepped out of camera range. By mid-April, the investigation had expanded to involve multiple units within the Columbus Police Department. Detectives continued to review surveillance footage, revisit interview subjects, and check areas beyond the immediate nightlife district. Searches along the Olentangy River were repeated, and additional wooded areas on campus were inspected. Despite these efforts, the investigation did not yield new information capable of defining Brian's movements or location. The case had shifted from an expected short-term missing person inquiry to a prolonged investigation with limited actionable data. The absence of an exit on video and the lack of any subsequent sightings remained the central unresolved elements. As the investigation progressed into the following weeks, detectives received a range of tips from across Ohio and surrounding states. Many came from individuals who believed they had seen someone resembling Brian, while others reported hearing secondhand information from acquaintances. Each tip required evaluation, but none were substantiated. Several reported sightings involved individuals in public spaces, shopping centers, parks, or transit hubs, but surveillance checks and follow-up interviews typically eliminated these reports quickly. The descriptions either failed to match Brian's appearance precisely or could not be verified through available footage. One of the more structured leads involved the possibility that Brian had traveled away from Columbus shortly after leaving the bar. Investigators checked transit stations, inter-city bus services, and airports for any trace of him. They reviewed passenger manifests where available and contacted facilities where identification might be required. None of these efforts produced evidence that Brian had left the city. Detectives also looked into abandoned buildings and construction zones near the university. These checks were conducted on multiple occasions, often with the assistance of specialized search teams. The Gateway area itself was under partial construction in 2006, and several access points led to unfinished sections. These locations were inspected thoroughly. No items associated with Brian were found. Public interest in the case led to additional media segments, which occasionally generated new tips. Some callers suggested checking areas farther from Columbus, while others speculated about encounters that occurred weeks after Brian's disappearance. Investigators verified these claims when possible, but found no evidence linking them to Brian. One notable detail in the case involved a phone call received by Brian's girlfriend on her mobile phone months after his disappearance. The call registered as originating from Brian's number, but the provider later confirmed that the connection was caused by a tower anomaly rather than active use. The detail gained significant attention but had no bearing on the underlying facts. Investigators determined that the phone had not been reactivated or used. Interviews continued with individuals close to Brian. Family members and friends repeated their earlier statements, and none offered new information that could change the direction of the investigation. Detectives also interviewed employees of nearby businesses, including late-night service workers who might have observed unusual activity in the early hours of April 1st. These conversations yielded no actionable leads. Police revisited the possibility that Brian had left through an unmonitored exit. They checked maintenance corridors and spaces accessible only to staff. These areas were documented and photographed, but none showed signs of unauthorized entry or exit. Inquiries into whether he might have used a service route or construction access path produced no supporting evidence. The absence of items belonging to Brian, such as clothing, identification, or personal effects, further limited investigative directions. No discarded objects were found in the surrounding district or along search routes. Waste collection areas were inspected and dumpsters were checked shortly after his disappearance, but nothing relevant was recovered. Despite the extensive efforts, each lead concluded without providing clarity. The investigation developed no confirmed sightings, no physical evidence, no financial or digital activity, and no verified exit from the bar. These unresolved factors continued to define the case as it moved into its next phase. As weeks turned into months, the disappearance of Brian Shaffer transitioned from an active search focused on immediate recovery to a long-term missing person case supported by periodic investigative reviews. The lack of new evidence posed significant challenges for detectives, who continued to examine the available information in an effort to identify overlooked details or unexplored avenues. The Gateway complex remained central to the case because it represented the last confirmed location where Brian was seen. The unusual nature of the surveillance anomaly, that every individual who left the bar appeared on camera except Brian, continued to draw attention. Detectives reevaluated the camera angles periodically to ensure that earlier reviews had not missed a crucial frame. Each new review reaffirmed the initial conclusion. The footage captured all visible movement in the monitored areas, and Brian did not appear in any exit sequence. Over time, the investigation's focus broadened to include the possibility that information might emerge from individuals who had been in the bar that night but had not come forward initially. Detectives released public requests for anyone with unreported details to contact police. Several individuals responded, but none provided information that altered the timeline or offered new insight into Brian's actions after his last recorded sighting. The absence of verified sightings also influenced the broader understanding of the case. Most missing person cases involving adult individuals produce at least some evidence of movement: financial transactions, communication attempts, travel records, or third-party observations. Brian's case produced none of these indicators. His accounts remained untouched, his phone inactive, and his personal records unchanged from the day he was last seen. As the investigation progressed, police maintained contact with Brian's family, updating them on search efforts and any procedural steps. Family members contributed to public awareness campaigns, distributing updated flyers and participating in media interviews to ensure the case remained visible. Their efforts helped maintain attention but did not yield new information. The campus community also responded. Student groups organized awareness events, and the university assisted by circulating information through internal channels. These actions generated additional coverage in local and regional media, which in turn prompted periodic waves of tips. Each tip was evaluated, but none produced actionable developments. The Columbus Police Department continued its periodic review of the case, revisiting key points in the timeline and checking whether technological or procedural advancements might support new investigative methods. Detectives compared the case to similar missing person incidents, but noted that the lack of evidence made such comparisons limited in usefulness. In the years following the disappearance, the case entered a phase characterized by maintenance rather than active development. Police retained the file as open, and any new information presented by the public was added to the record. Detectives also remained available to evaluate material submitted by independent investigators or individuals researching the case, though few contributions offered information beyond what was already known. The lack of resolution did not diminish the significance of the case within the Columbus community or the larger public. The combination of a well-documented timeline, extensive surveillance footage, and the absence of any confirmed exit made the disappearance notable. The case was frequently referenced in discussions of missing person investigations that involve dense public environments and modern surveillance systems. As time passed, the unanswered questions remained consistent. How did Brian leave the bar without appearing on camera? Did he exit through a route that investigators had not identified, or did he remain within the building in an area not covered by surveillance? Why were no personal items recovered? And why did no evidence of movement appear after the night of his disappearance? These questions persisted because they were grounded in the documented facts of the case. Investigators acknowledged the limitations imposed by the available evidence and the constraints of the surveillance system. They emphasized that without new information, any conclusions would be speculative and not supported by the verified record. The disappearance of Brian Shaffer remains unresolved. The case continues to be referenced in training materials, discussions of investigative methodology, and reviews of missing person procedures involving surveillance-rich environments. For law enforcement, it serves as a reminder of the complexities that can arise even when extensive footage and detailed timelines are available. For the public, the case stands as one of the most enduring missing person investigations associated with a major university community. It highlights the challenges of reconstructing movements within crowded venues and demonstrates how, despite thorough investigative work, certain key facts may remain unknown without new evidence. The file remains open with the Columbus Police Department. The passage of time has not altered the factual structure of the case. Brian Shaffer entered the Ugly Tuna Saloon on March 31st, 2006. He appeared on surveillance footage near the entrance shortly before closing. He stepped back into the bar, and he was not recorded leaving. These verified points continue to define the boundaries of the investigation, and in the absence of further information, the events that followed remain undetermined.